June 6, 1944. The skies over Normandy were filled with the thunder of War World II as Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. 156,000 troops, American, British, Canadian, stormed the beaches of France, braving mines, gunfire, and the treacherous tides of the English Channel. For the Allies, it was a monumental gamble. For Adolf Hitler, the Führer, it was a moment that would shake the foundations of the Third Reich. Inside the Führer headquarters, the atmosphere was tense but routine. Reports of minor skirmishes and sporadic shelling had been flowing for weeks, but Hitler, confident in his Atlantic Wall defenses and German forces stationed along the coast, believed any Allied landing would be contained. His staff relayed messages from field commanders, intelligence officers, and Luftwaffe units, each carefully filtered to reflect the expected resistance against any amphibious assault. Hitler, accustomed to precision, saw no reason to anticipate a full-scale invasion at that very moment. The first news of the landings arrived in fragmented reports. Observers described German officers scrambling to interpret radio intercepts, reconnaissance updates, and preliminary casualty reports. Hitler, according to surviving accounts and transcripts from aides, initially responded with disbelief. "They cannot have landed yet," he reportedly said, his voice sharp and incredulous. The Führer's aides presented maps showing potential landing sites, estimations of enemy strength, and timelines that contradicted the reality emerging from Normandy. But even as he reviewed the evidence, the tide of War World II was crashing against his expectations. At 6:30 a.m., the first fully confirmed reports reached Hitler's command bunker. Massive amphibious forces had successfully breached the Normandy coastline, encountering pockets of resistance but establishing footholds at Utor, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The number 156,000 appeared in transmission logs, though initially the figure seemed almost impossible to comprehend. For Hitler, who had prided himself on strategic foresight, the reality was a bitter shock. The meticulously planned Atlantic Wall, designed to repel any seaborne invasion, had been circumvented by sheer Allied ingenuity and determination. Rage followed disbelief. Witnesses recorded that Hitler's face flushed with anger, his hands trembling as he slammed documents on tables. "This cannot be happening," he shouted to his generals and aides. "I have foreseen every possibility, every contingency." The Führer demanded explanations from his senior commanders. Why the defenses had failed, why the Luftwaffe had not struck decisively, and why German intelligence had missed the scale and location of the invasion. His voice reverberated through the bunker, a mixture of fury, denial, and incredulity. Hitler's generals, many of whom had prepared for a defensive response, were caught between fear and duty. Field Marshal Rommel, stationed near the French coast, had predicted the potential for a large landing, but had been limited in forces and authority. Reports from commanders in Normandy were chaotic, with units struggling to coordinate responses under heavy bombardment. General von Rundstedt attempted to convey the severity of the situation, emphasizing the need for immediate counterattacks, yet Hitler remained unconvinced, dismissing the assessments as exaggerations or failures of communication. Private diaries and post-war testimonies capture the extraordinary tension within the Führer's headquarters. One officer recalled, "The room vibrated with rage. Hitler refused to believe the landings were successful. Maps were thrown aside, officers shouted over one another, and yet no one dared contradict him directly. The sense of shock was palpable. Our leader confronted a reality he had not anticipated, and his disbelief became a kind of paralysis." The initial chaos reflected not only strategic disorientation, but the human dimension of command under the stress of unexpected disaster. Meanwhile, the radio relays continued to confirm the landings. Photographs from reconnaissance planes, intercepted messages, and reports from forward observers left no room for doubt. Allied troops had not only reached the beaches, but were advancing inland, securing key positions and overwhelming local German defenses. For Hitler, the juxtaposition of expectation and reality was unbearable. His advisers and generals attempted to convey that the invasion was well underway and that immediate strategic responses were critical. But the Führer's disbelief slowed decision-making at a moment when speed was essential. The shock of D-Day was compounded by a perceived betrayal of intelligence. German commanders had been convinced by false signals, deceptive troop movements, and Allied misinformation campaigns that Normandy was not the main target. The scale and coordination of the Allied landing contradicted months of German assumptions and confidence. Hitler, reflecting on the Atlantic Wall's supposed impregnability, reportedly muttered, "Everything we prepared, wasted, all of it." The words underscored the personal and psychological impact of strategic failure upon a leader accustomed to total control. By mid-morning, the scope of the Allied success became undeniable. Reports from coastal commanders described the chaotic but effective movement of 156,000 troops inland, supported by artillery, naval bombardment, and air superiority. Hitler, still furious and incredulous, began issuing orders for countermeasures, though his rage and denial affected the clarity of command. Decisions were delayed, communication chains faltered, and a sense of panic filtered through the bunker. The initial disbelief of D-Day had transitioned into an urgent, almost irrational, fury at the audacity of the Allied operation. The human dimension of command under duress is starkly evident in these moments. Officers, trained for discipline and obedience, witnessed their leader struggling to process the enormity of the situation. Diaries recall that Hitler alternated between shouting, pacing, and reviewing maps obsessively, attempting to reconcile what he had predicted with the reality unfolding on the French coastline. The combination of shock, anger, and denial created an atmosphere of chaos at the very center of the Third Reich's command structure. As the morning progressed on June 6, 1944, the Führer's fury intensified. Reports from the front indicated that the Allied troops had not only established beachheads, but were moving inland, overcoming minefields, artillery positions, and defensive fortifications of the Atlantic Wall. Hitler, consumed by disbelief and anger, refused to accept the full scale of the invasion. "It cannot be this large," he reportedly shouted, slamming his fists onto maps spread across the table. His generals and aides, constrained by protocol and fear, hesitated to correct him, knowing that any direct contradiction might provoke a storm of rage. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, positioned near the French coast to oversee defenses, had predicted the possibility of a massive landing. Reports sent to Berlin detailed the scale of the Allied assault, urging rapid counterattacks using armored divisions held in reserve. Hitler, however, remained unconvinced. He demanded additional confirmation, delaying the deployment of panzer divisions critical to halting the enemy's advance. His indecision and disbelief created a vacuum of command, leaving German forces on the beaches to contend with a well-coordinated and numerically superior enemy. Inside the Führer bunker, chaos reigned. Officers moved frantically, relaying messages, analyzing reconnaissance photographs, and attempting to organize responses. Hitler's tirades echoed through the corridors, blending fury with frantic questioning. Why were our reserves not ready? Why did the Luftwaffe fail to strike decisively? This is a catastrophe. He demanded immediate explanations from his generals, who struggled to provide coherent answers amidst incomplete information and the speed of the Allied offensive. The juxtaposition of methodical planning and unfolding disaster created a palpable tension, a theater of disbelief at the very heart of the Third Reich. Private diaries from aides and generals illustrate the extraordinary psychological pressure in those hours. One officer wrote, "We were trapped between fear and duty." Hitler refused to believe the reports, yet the maps, photographs, and radio messages were clear. To speak plainly was dangerous. To remain silent was terrifying. Chaos reigned, not only in the field but within the Führer's mind. The human dimension of command during D-Day was as consequential as the tactical maneuvers occurring across the Channel. As the Allied troops advanced, Hitler's orders became increasingly erratic. Counterattacks were authorized piecemeal, delayed by communication bottlenecks and the Führer's oscillation between rage and denial. Panzer divisions, critical to reinforcing the front, were held back for hours longer than necessary, waiting for Hitler's approval. The opportunity to contain the beachheads and inflict decisive losses on the invaders slipped away. Generals on the ground, constrained by the rigid hierarchy and Hitler's unpredictable decision-making, found their hands tied as Allied forces consolidated their positions. Luftwaffe units, intended to provide air support and disrupt the landing forces, were deployed inconsistently, reflecting the confusion at the highest levels. Reconnaissance reports indicated that aircraft were delayed or misdirected, missing crucial windows to strike enemy positions. Hitler, enraged by the apparent incompetence or timidity of his subordinates, berated commanders in a mix of disbelief and fury. Witnesses recall that he paced relentlessly, gesturing violently at maps, demanding immediate rectification, yet failing to grasp that decisive action required coordination already disrupted by his delayed approvals. The Allied success at D-Day forced German commanders to confront a dual reality: the physical presence of 156,000 troops ashore and the psychological collapse of coherent command at the Führer's headquarters. Diaries, letters, and post-war testimonies all emphasize that Hitler's rage, combined with disbelief, paralyzed strategic decision-making in the critical early hours. Orders were contradictory, counterattacks disjointed, and reserves deployed too late to affect the outcome. In many respects, the human reaction inside the bunker mirrored the chaos unfolding on the beaches. Private moments of reflection among generals reveal the extraordinary tension between duty and fear. Officers recognized the scale of the Allied success, understood the tactical necessities for an effective response, yet were constrained by Hitler's unpredictable and emotional directives. One senior officer later recalled, "We knew the enemy was exploiting every weakness, yet every time we proposed action, we encountered denial or fury. The Führer's disbelief was contagious. It slowed our response when rapid, decisive movement could have changed the course of the day." By mid-afternoon, the initial German counterattacks, hastily coordinated under pressure and plagued by delayed orders, largely failed to dislodge the Allies. Armor units engaged piecemeal, artillery was misallocated, and infantry divisions struggled to reach critical positions. Hitler's insistence on micromanagement, combined with his refusal to believe that the invasion was both massive and coordinated, contributed directly to the disjointed defensive efforts. The combination of his rage, denial, and micromanagement created a leadership vacuum in a moment when clarity and decisiveness were paramount. Witness accounts describe Hitler's frustration reaching a fever pitch. Maps were overturned, reports torn, and aides struck with fear as the Führer ranted about failure, betrayal, and incompetence. He alternated between demands for immediate counterattacks and expressions of disbelief that the Allies could have successfully landed at all. This emotional volatility delayed critical decisions, allowing the 156,000 Allied troops to secure beachheads, organize supply chains, and push inland, solidifying the gains that would become the foundation of the liberation of Western Europe. By evening, it became clear to those inside the Führer's headquarters that the invasion could not be easily contained. Hitler's rage had not abated, yet the reality of the beachheads, the entrenched Allied positions, and the speed of their advance forced begrudging acknowledgement that D-Day had succeeded. Still, the Führer refused to fully accept the magnitude of the defeat, oscillating between denial, fury, and frantic directives for countermeasures. The chaos at the command center mirrored the unprecedented scale of the operation, capturing the intersection of psychological shock and the brutal consequences of leadership under duress in War World II. By the late afternoon of June 6, 1944, the reality of D-Day had fully penetrated the Führer's bunker. The reports were undeniable. Allied forces had not only landed 156,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy, but were advancing inland, capturing key positions and overwhelming local defenses. Hitler, who had spent the morning oscillating between denial and rage, now faced the stark truth. Witnesses described the moment as a psychological fracture, when disbelief gave way to a mix of fury, despair, and obsessive attempts to reclaim control over a rapidly deteriorating situation. Maps were strewn across tables, marked with colored pins indicating beachheads, German positions, and areas of intense fighting. Hitler's eyes, previously flashing with incredulity, now burned with anger as he reviewed the operational reports. "How could this happen?" he shouted. "Every defensive measure was in place, every calculation precise, and yet they are ashore unstoppable." Generals and aides, some pale with fear, struggled to relay additional intelligence, knowing that any misstep could provoke an outburst. The Führer's rage had reached a fever pitch, and his emotional volatility now dictated the pace and clarity of German command. Inside the command center, the chaos was palpable. Officers scrambled to coordinate fragmented divisions, relay orders to distant units, and interpret conflicting battlefield reports. Hitler's fury interfered with operational efficiency, creating delays in deploying panzer divisions and Luftwaffe support to counter the entrenched Allied troops. Diaries and post-war accounts reveal that even senior officers recognized the futility of attempting to impose order, while their leader wrestled with the enormity of the strategic failure. One officer wrote, "We were paralyzed not by the enemy alone, but by the Führer's disbelief and rage. Our plans, our judgment, all subordinated to the emotional storm in the room." Reports from Normandy indicated that Allied artillery, naval bombardment, and coordinated infantry advances had already disrupted German defensive lines. Units that were supposed to resist the landings were retreating or being bypassed, leaving gaps for Allied forces to exploit. Hitler, confronted with these reports, struggled to reconcile the scale of the success with his prior assumptions about the impregnable Atlantic Wall. His disbelief, once a shield against panic, now morphed into frantic demands for counterattacks that were increasingly uncoordinated and logistically impossible. The psychological impact of D-Day on the Führer was mirrored by the reactions of his generals. Field Marshal Rommel, who had consistently warned about the potential for a large-scale landing, attempted to urge rapid, flexible responses. Hitler, however, mistrusted both the reports and the recommendations, accusing subordinates of incompetence or exaggeration. The tension between accurate intelligence and the emotional reception of that information created a paralysis at the strategic level, further compounding the Allies' advantage. Private accounts and memoirs detail the Führer's emotional volatility. Officers recall that Hitler alternated between pacing, shouting, reviewing maps, and silent brooding. His aides, aware of the danger of contradicting him, tried to convey the magnitude of the Allied landing carefully, emphasizing the numerical strength, beachhead success, and inland progress. Each time, Hitler's reaction oscillated between furious denial and obsessive attempts to issue last-minute directives. The room, normally a center of discipline and command, had become a theater of chaos, reflecting the unprecedented nature of the invasion and the psychological shock it inflicted. As evening fell, the full strategic consequences became clearer. The German defensive network, carefully constructed over years, was failing under the weight of the Allied assault. Panzer divisions that could have countered the landings were delayed, misallocated, or engaged piecemeal. Luftwaffe support, hampered by earlier confusion and Hitler's indecision, was unable to deliver decisive strikes against entrenched beachheads. Reports of heavy casualties, logistical bottlenecks, and advancing enemy forces created a grim picture. The German command structure, paralyzed by disbelief and emotional volatility, could not respond effectively to the largest amphibious invasion in history. The human dimension of command during this critical moment is stark. Hitler's aides, generals, and communications officers were forced to operate under the strain of both operational urgency and the unpredictable emotional state of the Führer. Diaries recount the fear and tension. Every decision was filtered through the lens of avoiding personal rebuke, even as the enemy consolidated gains on French soil. The juxtaposition of rational tactical necessity and emotional chaos created a unique portrait of command under extreme stress during War World II. By late night, Hitler's acknowledgement of the invasion's success was partial and reluctant. While rage and denial persisted, he could no longer ignore the undeniable reports of Allied beachheads and inland movement. Private notes from aides indicate that the Führer oscillated between issuing contradictory orders, reviewing maps obsessively, and retreating into grim contemplation. The dissonance between expectation and reality, combined with the scale of the operation, left the Führer in a state of shock, a psychological paralysis mirrored by the chaotic command of German forces in Normandy. Even as Hitler began to grasp the magnitude of the Allied success, the consequences of his delayed decisions became apparent. The initial hours of the landing, when decisive counterattacks might have limited the Allies' ability to consolidate positions, had passed. The operational window for reversing the invasion had closed, leaving German forces to react under increasingly unfavorable conditions. Hitler's fury, disbelief, and micromanagement had unintentionally contributed to the strategic failure. The night of June 6 also marked a turning point in the perception of War World II's trajectory within the Führer's headquarters. Officers and aides, observing the psychological strain of Hitler, began to recognize that leadership had fractured under pressure. The invasion had succeeded, and the shock and rage at the center of the German command structure highlighted a critical lesson. The emotional state of a single leader could have profound operational consequences. D-Day was not only a tactical victory for the Allies, but also a psychological demonstration of the cascading effects of disbelief and rage in command. By the early hours of June 7, 1944, the Führer's disbelief had evolved into a furious and almost desperate recognition. The Allied invasion of Normandy was not a temporary setback. It was a monumental success. 156,000 troops had established beachheads, advanced inland, and begun consolidating their positions, defying every prediction and expectation Hitler had held. Witnesses describe a Führer consumed by rage, pacing endlessly through his headquarters, slamming his fists onto maps, and issuing a torrent of contradictory orders in a futile attempt to regain control of an already lost situation. Hitler's generals and aides, exhausted from the chaos of the previous day, now faced the full force of his emotional and strategic collapse. Communications were fragmented, and units in Normandy were already facing the reality of Allied firepower, naval support, and air superiority. Hitler's frustration, once restrained by disbelief, now expressed itself in vehement accusations toward his commanders. "Incompetence," he reportedly shouted repeatedly. "Where are our armored divisions? Where is the Luftwaffe? How could you allow this?" His rage, punctuated by trembling hands and sharp gestures, was as much a psychological blow to his staff as the military disaster itself. Inside the Führer bunker, a sense of helplessness permeated the room. Officers, accustomed to strict hierarchy and obedience, struggled to reconcile Hitler's furious directives with the operational reality on the ground. Many attempted to provide reasoned assessments of the invasion, emphasizing the need for coordinated counterattacks and strategic withdrawals, but their words often fell on deaf ears or were met with furious outbursts. Diaries and post-war testimonies describe the emotional strain, a mixture of fear, awe, and disbelief as the Führer confronted a defeat of historic magnitude. Hitler's emotional collapse mirrored the tactical and strategic failure unfolding in Normandy. German defenses, meticulously prepared along the Atlantic Wall, were being bypassed or destroyed. Panzer divisions had been delayed, misallocated, or engaged ineffectively due to earlier indecision, and the Luftwaffe struggled to provide timely support against entrenched Allied positions. Hitler, now fully aware of the scale of the invasion, attempted to rectify past delays through frantic orders, yet the speed, coordination, and overwhelming numbers of Allied forces made decisive action impossible. Accounts from aides and generals highlight the surreal nature of command under extreme stress. Hitler alternated between issuing urgent, often contradictory commands and retreating into moments of stunned silence. He reviewed maps obsessively, marking divisions that could no longer intervene and projecting potential scenarios that had already passed. One aide recalled, "It was as if the Führer was fighting against time itself, against the reality of success that he could not undo." The entire room seemed to exist in suspended chaos, caught between operational necessity and the Führer's emotional storm. The human cost of D-Day was evident not only on the beaches of Normandy, but within the walls of the Führer's command center. Officers noted that Hitler's rage, denial, and frustration directly impeded coherent decision-making. Communications faltered, counterattack orders conflicted, and critical units were deployed ineffectively. The psychological impact of confronting an unanticipated and monumental Allied success had translated directly into operational paralysis, highlighting the profound connection between leadership, emotion, and military effectiveness in War World II. By mid-morning, Hitler's recognition of defeat became more explicit. While he continued to issue frantic orders, his aides and generals understood that the strategic window to contain the invasion had passed. The Allies had secured vital beachheads, artillery positions, and supply lines, ensuring that further German countermeasures could only slow, not prevent, their advance. Hitler's personal shock and disbelief, combined with the loss of operational control, marked a turning point in the Third Reich's ability to respond to the liberation of Western Europe. The psychological toll on the Führer was compounded by the realization that months of meticulous preparation had been rendered ineffective. The Atlantic Wall, once considered impregnable, had been breached. German intelligence, misled by Allied deception campaigns, had failed to predict both the timing and scale of the invasion. Hitler's fury, alternating with bitter introspection, reflected the stark confrontation between expectation and reality. He reportedly muttered, "All of our planning, all of our strength, and yet they are ashore, unstoppable. How could I have misjudged so completely?" As D-Day continued, Hitler's command became increasingly reactive rather than proactive. Orders for counterattacks were issued too late, reinforcements were misdirected, and coordination among German units faltered. Diaries from officers describe a sense of resignation mixed with fear. The Führer's emotional collapse left them struggling to maintain operational cohesion amidst unprecedented disaster. The juxtaposition of strategic failure and psychological turmoil provides a vivid portrait of leadership under extreme duress during War World II. By the evening of June 7, Hitler's acknowledgement of the invasion's success was unavoidable. Reports confirmed that Allied forces had not only held the beaches, but had begun advancing toward key objectives in Normandy, establishing a secure foothold in continental Europe. The scale of the operation, the coordination of naval, air, and ground forces, and the sheer determination of the Allies left no room for denial. Hitler, confronted with these irrefutable facts, exhibited a combination of rage, despair, and obsessive attempts to micromanage responses that could no longer alter the outcome. Private letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies reveal the human dimension of this crisis. Officers recorded the strain of attempting to execute coherent strategies under a leader who was emotionally overwhelmed. The chaos at the heart of the Third Reich mirrored the tactical and operational chaos on the beaches of Normandy, illustrating how disbelief, anger, and psychological shock can magnify the consequences of a battlefield disaster. The long-term consequences of D-Day were now clear to Hitler and his commanders. The successful Allied landing marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe, the irreversible weakening of German control, and the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. Hitler's fury and disbelief could not reverse these events, and the strategic window for decisive German action had closed. The psychological and operational paralysis within the Führer's headquarters underscored the profound impact of leadership under extreme stress in War World II, illustrating that even the most meticulously prepared military structures can be undone by a combination of enemy ingenuity, timing, and human reaction to unexpected disaster. In the final analysis, D-Day was both a tactical and psychological defeat for Hitler. The 156,000 Allied troops ashore represented not only the tangible loss of territory and resources, but also a blow to the Führer's perception of invincibility. Diaries, post-war testimonies, and intercepted communications reveal a man grappling with failure, confronting the limits of control, and witnessing the unraveling of strategic plans under the combined weight of disbelief, rage, and operational reality. The liberation of Normandy had begun, and with it, the inexorable decline of the Third Reich in Western Europe.